What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Kilo Loco, and today I'm going to be talking about architecture and SwiftUI. Now, when SwiftUI dropped in 2019, we saw that, there was this new way to lay out views. And when we started to go and dive into SwiftUI, there were a lot of things that I feel that the community kind of forgot about. And one of the most important things was architecture or design patterns. Now, before SwiftUI had dropped, there was a lot of discussion around how you should be architecting your app and, whether to use MVC, MVVM, Viper, all these other different, design patterns. Well, I want to kind of dive back into architecture, and I want to show you how you can use your pre-existing architecture with a couple of tweaks and, continue to use the knowledge that you've already gained about architecture and design patterns and apply it to SwiftUI. So let's jump in. Alrighty, so this is our project. Now we're in the scene delegate, your typical scene delegate, nothing special about it. Over here, in the project navigator, we can see that there's a couple extra files I added in here. If you would like the starter project or the finished project, there is a link in the description below. So go ahead and check that out. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create a function that's going to return a UI view controller that we can set to our root view controller. So let's go ahead and create one for our users view controller. All right, so this is the function that we're going to be using in order to return a user's view controller. Now remember, the reason why we're returning a UI view controller is because a UI hosting controller is still a view controller. It conforms to UI view controller. It's just making sure that it has this generic object content which conforms to a view. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a user's content view, and then we're also going to create a user's view controller, which is going to use that user's content view inside it as the root view. Let's go ahead and create a group for that. So we won't be using any previews in this tutorial, so I'm going to remove this preview over here. Now that we have the user's content view, let's go ahead and create the user's view controller as well. Let's make sure that we import SwiftUI so that we can subclass from UI hosting controller. Now that we have our user's view controller, we can actually return it in our function that's in our scene delegate. Let's go ahead and throw that bad boy in there by creating our content view and then our view controller. So as we can see, we have this user's view controller function, which is going to return a UI view controller, and that's going to actually just be our UI hosting view controller, which is going to take in our user's content view as the root view. So this would allow us to work with SwiftUI for our view, but we could also do a lot of the same things that we would normally do in a UI view controller inside of our user's view controller. All we need to do now is set this user's view controller to our root view controller of our window. And just to make sure that you know that I'm not lying to you, what we're going to do is we're going to delete the content view. We're going to delete the file, and we're going to go to our user's content view and make sure that the text is something a little bit different. All right, so now that we have all these things connected, let's go ahead and run it in our simulator and make sure that it works. And bam, there you go, architecture in SwiftUI. So this is the entire premise of what we're going to be doing. We're going to be working with our view layer in our content view, which means that we're going to be able to use all the great things about SwiftUI and make sure that it's only view related stuff. Back over in our view controller, we'll be able to do our business logic, which will allow us to do things like networking requests and things like retrieving data from our persistence layer, such as core data or Realm or SQLite. And we'll be able to handle all that logic in here. Now, what we need to do is we need to go a little bit further and start connecting a few things so that we can do something that would happen in a normal application. In this example, I'm going to be using a networking request to get the users back. So let's go ahead and add in our networking service right now. All right, so as you can see, we're going to be creating our networking service in our initializer, which all we're going to do is we're going to override the root view initializer, we're going to set our networking service to a new instance of that networking service. And then we're going to make sure we're going to call super.init and then pass in the root view once again, just so that we can keep that same UI hosting behavior, UI hosting controller behavior, just like normal. All right, now it's time to get those users. All right, so this is the function that we're going to use to get our users. Now what we need to do is we need to call this somewhere. Unfortunately, UI hosting controller no longer allows view did load to work properly. So if you put anything in a view did load function, it won't be working like it used to. So that means that we have two different places that we can call this get users that would make sense. One would be right here in the initializer, which means that get users would be called immediately whenever this object is created. Or the second option would be to actually call it in a view will appear, which does continue to work just as you would expect it to in a UI hosting controller. For this case, since we're probably going to be interested in any new users, let's go ahead and call it in view will appear. All right, so now that we're calling get users and our view will appear, as soon as we have our application load up, it's going to call this function, it's going to hit this networking request, and it's going to print out those users. So let's go ahead and run that, make sure that it works. I just want to let you know that these networking services, or this networking service specifically, is not done properly. This is all just an example of showing you how to interact with your currently existing networking layer or persistence layer. But if you were to look at the file, this would not be the proper approach to implementing a networking service. So let's go ahead and take a look at the results, and we can see that we got all that juicy, delicious data down there in our logs. This means that our networking service is working. Everything's working as expected so far. But Kilo, how do we get this data from here into our root view or our content view? Well, I'm going to show you. Let's go ahead and take a look at users content view real quick. Now I want you to notice that users content view is a struct, and usually you don't want to modify structs. If you're going to have a variable inside your struct and then you set that variable, whenever you update that variable, you're not actually updating the variable, you're actually creating a whole new struct in place of that currently existing struct, and then modifying that one property on that struct, and this new struct essentially takes place of that old struct. So in short, it just means that instead of actually updating this property, you would be replacing the whole view. And we can't actually do that with SwiftUI. We can't directly modify properties on our view. So what we need to do is we need to create an observable object. And this observable object will either act as maybe you would call it a view model, some would call it just state, but what I'm going to actually call it is I'm going to call it source of truth. So we're going to have a user source of truth in here, which is going to allow us to understand what the current state is of our view controller, of our view, like all the data that we're going to be using, and we're going to be observing that since it's going to be an observable object. So let me show you what I mean. All right, so now we have this user's source of truth object, and this is going to be where I'm going to be making any updates from my view controller and storing anything. So I'm not actually going to store any arrays or anything that has to do with state in my view controller. I'm also not going to store anything that has to do with state in my content view. I'm actually going to do all that storing right here. So what we'll do is we'll have a property called users. It'll be an array of users, and it's actually going to be property wrapped with the published property wrapper. This way we can observe anytime it changes. So now that we have this users array, and since it's technically a publisher, since it has this @published property wrapper on it, what we can do is we can go over to our content view and add an instance of our source of truth. So since we're going to be having a source of truth and it's going to be an observable object, we need to make sure that it's going to be a var. It cannot be a let, or else it's just not going to essentially work. So observed object lets us observe this object, and the user's source of truth is what we're going to be observing. One last thing I want to say about the user's source of truth is that if I were to continue growing out this feature and it was going to store more things than just users for this particular view controller, like if there were different things that I was getting back from my user's view controller and there was different state that I wanted to save, I would continue to put anything that's related to this user's view controller, and I would store it in our source of truth here along with the users. So any state that I wanted to save and have updated and observable by our content view, I would keep it in our user's source of truth. All right, let's get back to our user's content view and let's go ahead and create a list which is going to allow us to show each of the users. All right, so now that we have our source of truth, we can say .users, and what we're going to do in this list is it's going to take each user that's in our users array from our source of truth. It's going to pass in that specific user, and we're going to use the user the user's property name to populate this text. So that's going to essentially give us a table view. Let's go ahead and check it out. Oh, and it looks like I have an error. So let's go ahead and check out where we went wrong. So remember that when I updated the user's content view, if we go ahead and take a look at it, now we have this var SOT, source of truth, and we don't have an initializer, and we're not actually setting that property, right? So what we need to do is, since it's a struct, it gives us that automatic initializer for us, and we'll actually have an initializer which is going to have the SOT value that we can pass in there. All we need to do is pass in a new instance of our user's source of truth. So let's do that in our scene delegate now. All right, so as you can see, now that we're creating an instance of the user's source of truth right here, we're passing it into our user's content view, and everything else is going and flowing just the way that it was before. User's content view being passed into our user's view controller, and we're returning that user's view controller. All right, and then now the very last thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we're connecting our users that we're getting in our view controller to the source of truth from our user's content view. So let's jump back into our user's view controller. And instead of just printing out these users, what we're going to do is we're going to access our root view, which we have access to by default since we're inside of a UI hosting controller. And we're going to set the SOT.users to the users that we get back from this networking request. All right, so as you can see, we're grabbing the root view, and since we know that that root view is of type user's content view, we have access to all of its properties, one of which is the source of truth, and the source of truth has a user's property, and we can just set the users that we're getting back in our networking request to those users. Let's go ahead and run it. And boom goes the dynamite. So as you can see, this is how we're going to be moving forward. We're going to be creating sources of truth for each of our features. We're going to be updating those sources of truth with wherever we're getting our data from. In this case, it was a networking service. In the next case, it'll be from core data or our persistence service. And then we'll be updating that source of truth, that property, which is being observed by our content view. So let's go ahead and do the same thing real quick for animals, which, as we can see over here, the animal is actually from core data, which we're storing right here. So I'm going to create a new group and go ahead and go through those steps one more time. All right, so as you can see, we have an animal's content view, an animal's view controller, and an animal's source of truth. So starting back over here at our animal's content view, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add in a property for the source of truth. We're going to go ahead and update the animal source of truth to contain an array of animals. Then we're going to go back to our scene delegate and create a function that's going to create an animal's view controller. So as we can see, we just did the same exact thing that we did for our user's view controller, but copied it for the animal's view controller. We're going to create an animal source of truth. This is where we're going to store all of our state. We have the SwiftUI ContentView, right? So we need to pass in our animal's source of truth into the animal's content view so that we can access that property. And then we're going to create an animal's view controller with that content view, then return it. Now, what we can do is we can just simply swap it out with the animal's view controller function. Now our Windows root view controller will be this animal's view controller. But we don't currently have anything in there that's special. We can still go to the animal's content view and say something like hello from animal's view controller. And this will at least let us know that we're currently going down the right path. So let's give it a shot. All right, great. So hello from animal's content, or from animal's view controller. But what we want to do is we actually want to be able to see both of our view controllers, right? And we want to do that with something like a tab bar controller. So let's go back to our scene delegate and let's go ahead and update some of these things so that this starts looking like a more modern or at least normal looking app. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have these two functions that create our view controllers, the user's view controller and the animal's view controller functions. And I'm going to give each of these view controllers a navigation controller. And then what I'll do is I'll use these two view controllers and pass in each of their outputs, the UI view controller. And I'll put those in a tab bar controller so that we can select between both of the different features that we want to view. All right, to quickly go back and see what I did, I simply created that navigation controller, made sure that it had the large titles on it, also gave each of them a title, and I did that for both functions that create our view controllers. I created instances of both of them up here, created a tab bar controller, which is going to hold both of them, set those that user's view controller and the animal's view controller as the view controllers inside of our tab bar. And since this is going to load up as soon as the screen loads, we're going to say animated is equal to false. And we're going to set our window root view controller to the tab bar view controller, which is holding the users and the animal's VC. Let's run that, see what it looks like. And there we go. Nice and sexy. So we have our animals VC, we have our users VC, both of them are continuing to work as we would expect it to on a normal app, and we're still using SwiftUI. All right, so now what we need to do is we need to go to our animals view controller, update the logic so that we can actually get our animals from our persistence layer. Head back over to the animals view controller. Let's go ahead and add in our persistence service. All right, so now that we have our persistence service added into our animals view controller, let's create a function that's going to grab our animals and set it to the animals property inside of our source of truth. All right, so we have our get animals function, and all we're going to do is we're going to directly set the source of truth dot animals right here to this function that returns an array of animals. And this does it synchronously, so we don't actually need to put in a closure. Our persistence layer is able to just fetch those and then stick them right into our source of truth and update that. And we're calling that directly from the view will appear right here. Now, all we need to do is head back over to our content view, add a list, and make sure we populate that list. All right, there we go. And it looks like I have a small problem inside of our animal object. And the problem is that our animal object doesn't actually conform to identifiable. So if we go ahead and take a look at the animal object right here in our core data, we can see that we have the ID and the name. all we're going to do is we're going to just simply add in the ID right here to our list. And that will let it know to use the animal object's ID as the ID for this list. Now I could have obviously made it identifiable, but this is pretty straightforward too. But let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. So once again, getting our users, that's still coming from the internet. Go over to our animals and bam, we have our animals, which is coming from our persistence layer. And just so that you can see the persistence layer real quick and get a small little glance at it, it is in services. Let's take a look. And this is the function, get animals. It's doing a fetch request, and then we're just simply returning that result. Well, that's pretty much it on displaying, but what we want to do is we still want to be able to interact with things when our view does receive some type of interaction, right? So like if I were to hit pig, B, or if I were to go to users and tap Andrew, I want to be able to do something with that. Now, I personally don't like having data flow into the source of truth, or like having events flow into the source of truth. I feel like that's where I keep all my state. In regards to handling actions and events, I actually want to have that happen directly in the view, and I want the view controller to be able to handle that by accessing the view and observing changes from the view directly. So what I'm going to do is I want to create a publisher on both of my views, which is going to simply pass back the event, or actually in this case we want to pass back like the animal object that was tapped, right? So we want to pass that back to our view controller, and the way that we're going to do that is by creating a publisher using a pass-through subject. Now a pass-through subject kind of works similar to a closure, but it's a publisher that's going to allow us to pass some type of object and also allow us to decide if there's any type of failure cases. In this case, we only need to pass an object, and there will never be any failure cases, because whenever you tap on an animal or a user, there won't be any type of error with simply tapping. So let's go ahead and add in a publisher or a pass-through subject that's going to allow our animals content view to communicate with the animals view controller. And in order to use pass-through subjects or publishers, we're actually going to need to import combine. So unfortunately, we can't do this with closures. We will have to use combine in order to handle pass-through subjects. But now that we have this selected animal publisher, and it's internal property, which means that we can see it from our view controller, we can access this selected animal publisher and observe events. But before we jump back over to the view controller, let's go ahead and handle the taps whenever the text is tapped. So as you can see, all I did was I added this function that says on tap gesture. So whenever this text, which is currently showing the name, receives a tap, it's going to run this function in here. It's going to run this block of code. Now in this block of code, I'm accessing our publisher, our selected animal publisher, and I'm sending it the value that was displayed in this text. So the animal that's passed in right here, whenever I receive this tap, it's going to send that same animal back through our publisher. And all we have to do is go back to our animals view controller and observe that. So what I'll do is I'll create a function that's going to set up our observations whenever we receive any type of communication with our root view. And I'll call that from the initializer, since I only want to have this set up once ever. All right, so as you can see, we created this configure communication function. It's going to set up the publisher sync. And what sync essentially means is to observe any values that pass through or that are being published. So the same animal that's being passed from our animal content view over here, the one that we're sending here, is going to end up in the sync, and it's going to be this object, this animal object right here, and we can do whatever we want with it. In this case, I'm going to print it for just right now. And what we'll also notice is that we're getting this warning. And the reason that we're getting this warning is because sync actually returns, if you do option click and you take a look at it, it returns any cancelable. And the reason for that is because if we actually were to run this, by the end of this function, it would actually fall out of memory. So the observer, this sync, will actually fall out of memory and we won't be receiving any updates. So what we need to do is we need to hold a reference to the essentially it's like a token that's going to keep this this observer alive. So let me go ahead and create a selected animal token so that we can make sure that our sync stays alive. And once again, keep in mind that anytime that we're working with a publisher or a cancelable, we need to make sure that we import combine. So now our warning has gone away. The token that's being passed from our sync is being stored in our selected animal token, and this will essentially be deallocated whenever our animal's view controller is deallocated. Thus, it will keep our function alive, and we'll be able to observe whenever an animal is tapped. And right here, we're going to be printing out the name. So let's go ahead and run that and give it a try. All right, there we go. We're on users. Let's go over to animals. Let's go ahead and tap on one of the animal names. And as you can see, print it to the console. So whenever I click, we're getting that print to print out the name. Let's take it one step further. Let's get an alert to show. I actually created an extension that will allow us to print out an alert very easily. And let's go ahead and add this functionality to both the animals and to the users so that we get some type of update whenever we tap a user's name as well. All right, so as you can see, I made this small update where it's self.present alert with whatever message that we want to present. So it's going to say you have selected and then the animal's name. And this is just in our extension that I created where I'm simply presenting an alert with some type of string, just a typical UI alert controller. Now, I also went over to the user's view controller. I made sure that I had a selected user token. I made sure to add the configure communication. I need to make sure that I call it from the root view. In our configure communication, we're doing the same thing as in the animals view controller. We're setting whatever the sync's token is to our selected user token. And then I'm passing in a user this time. And right here, I'm going to be presenting an alert that says this user's or this person's name is, and then it's going to say their name. Over in the user's content view, we can see that I also imported combine, and I have a selected user publisher, which is once again a pass-through subject of type user and never. And whenever we receive a tap on that text of the user's name, we're going to actually be sending the entire user object to that publisher. So let's go ahead and run this and give it a try. So here we go. Let's go ahead and tap on a user's name and bam, this person's name is Kyle. Bam, this person's name is Xavier. Perfect. Go over to animals and you have selected B, Fox. So as you can see, a lot of the stuff that we already know can still be used. We can still use view controllers. We can still keep our views separate. And all we really need to do is introduce this new concept of a source of truth, a view model, or some type of state that's going to publish the values and allow our content view to be updated accordingly. Another shift in thinking is the way that we're actually passing data, since we are working with structs for our views. So we need to start using combine or some type of other reactive process in order to pass data from our views, which are structs. We could do that with a pass-through subject, which is just a publisher,
We could create our own publisher. There's a lot of different ways that we can go about this, but all the concepts are fundamentally the same. Now, one last thing is that I don't want you to think that you should be creating view controllers like this in your scene delegate. This is not the place. If I had more time, I could actually go through and show you an entire pattern of how I would set all of this up, but I would probably use coordinators. You can use routers. You could do a lot of different things, but please don't have all this code inside of your scene delegate. There should be an entire object that manages that for you. But the concept is still the same. You create a view controller, you set it to your window, and you follow the same thing that you've been doing in UIKit for years. So that's pretty much it on architecture with SwiftUI.
Well, that's going to do it for today's episode. Hope you learned something new. Let me know what you think about using view controllers and SwiftUI together, and whether you think that this is a good architecture moving forward for the community, or if it has some problems which maybe I don't seem to understand. But leave it all down below, and make sure that you share this video with the rest of the community so that we can also spread awareness of how we should be architecting apps. Thanks again. Go out there and keep coding passionately.